Good morning. Hello and welcome everyone to today's event, the ISIS Files, Policing as Rebel Governance, the Islamic State Police. Before introducing our speakers and the authors of today's report, I just want to welcome everyone here today. My name is Deborah Margolin, and I'm the Director of Strategic Initiatives and a Senior Research Fellow at the Program on Extremism. In this capacity, I've been lucky enough to get to work on the ISIS Files digital repository, a collection of over 15,000 pages of documents left behind by the Islamic State and collected by New York Times journalist Rukmini Callimachi and her Iraqi colleagues while embedded with the Iraqi military. I'd like to note that the original documents have all been returned to the Iraqi embassy in Washington, D.C. The Program on Extremism would like to thank the GW Libraries and Academic Innovation team for our ongoing partnership and collaboration. Under the leadership of Dean Geneva Henry, the wonderful team at GW Libraries and Academic Innovation has worked hard to set up and maintain the digital repository. Furthermore, together, our teams have made an extraordinary effort to create and uphold an ethical framework which guides this project. Due to our commitment to uphold this ethical framework, as well as the large size and scale of the upcoming batches of files, we have decided to take our time to ensure that these documents adhere to our ethical principles and are made accessible to all. As such, this process is going to take a bit more time, and the documents associated with today's report will be released in the very near future. With that, I'd like to introduce today's speakers and the authors of the report, the ISIS Files, Policing as Rebel Governance, the Islamic State Police. We are joined today by Beatrice de Graaf, who holds the Chair of History and International Relations and Global Governance at Utrecht University within the strategic theme of Institutions for Open Societies. In December 2019, she was awarded the title of Distinguished Professor, and she's also the co-founder of the Center for Terrorism and Counterterrorism at Leiden University, The Hague. Her book, Evaluating Counterterrorism Performance, has been internationally ranked as one of the top 150 terrorism books by Perspectives on Terrorism. She's also one of the editors of Terrorism and Political Violence and the Journal of Modern European History. Dr. de Graaf is also a fellow at the Program on Extremism. We are also joined today by Dr. Ahmed Yela, the director of the Center of Homeland Security at DeSales University and assistant professor of Homeland Security. Dr. Yela is also a member of the faculty at Georgetown University School of Continuing Studies program in the Masters of Applied Intelligence. Additionally, Dr. Yela is a 20-year veteran of the Counterterrorism and Operations Department at the Turkish National Police and served as Chief of Police in the Chief of the Counterterrorism in Urfa, Turkey. Dr. Yela is also a research fellow at the Program on Extremism. I'd like to remind our audience to please put questions into our chat function. After our presenters speak, we will address these questions through a discussion. And without further ado, I'd now like to hand over to our speakers. Please bear with us as we share the slides.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I welcome you all to our panel today. I hope everyone is doing well. So let's start. Policing as rebel governance, the Islamic State Police. It has been a challenge to work on this project. It's been, I think, with Beatrice over 15 months now, back and forth between the United States and the Netherlands. I hope you like the output and the product itself. So first of all, the introduction. What we see here in the picture is the Islamic State Al-Baraka province police station in Ash-Shadadi. Oftentimes, when we think about the Islamic State, we focus on the terrorism aspect of the ISIS. However, what we can understand when we get into the ground, essentially they ran a state and they needed the organizations that would support that state on the ground. So from that perspective, they needed an ordinary public order and law enforcement agency. They would support the activities of the Islamic State on the ground. For years, ISIS ran an effective rebel government on the ground, successfully actually. Oftentimes from the academia, from the press, we heard about the EMNI, ISIS Public Security Department or the Intelligence Department, the Hizbah, ISIS Religious Compliance Department, and their activities. It was rare that we heard about the Islamic State Police or Shurta in Arabic. So I think it is one of the first studies that would focus on the Islamic State Police. Next, please. So on the left, we see another title from the Islamic State, Devlet al-İslamiye, Vilayet-i Ninava al-Shurta al-İslamiye. So basically, Ninava region Islamic Police, Islamic State Police. So when we're looking at this research, we focused on 4 broad questions. How did the Islamic State fit within the ISIS design for rebel rule? Essentially, their function as a police organization under rebel rule. What kind of practices ISIS police was pushing on the ground, their enforcement, their structure? Essentially, we looked at the police organization itself as well. And then finally, we asked the question of if we could consider this type of rule-efficient governance with efficient understood as working in a well-organized and competent way, and maybe perhaps even emblematic of statehood. So from a variety of perspectives, ISIS police was supporting the Islamic State as a state. So we wanted to understand if that role was successfully carried out and what the people living under their rule and their thinking and what their perception was. Next, please. So these 2 are pictures from Raqqa Police Department front gate that were taken in June 2014. We had 2 sources for this study. The first is based on GW ISIS files project, which Deborah explained at the beginning. So we used those files which were associated and related with the ISIS police activities. The second is to better understand how the Islamic State police operated on the ground, and the questions associated with the files we were looking at. We carried out semi-structured interviews with 2 defectors. These 2 defectors interacted with the Islamic State police during their time within ISIS. So they knew their activities firsthand. Essentially, they gave us internal information about their activities and what was happening on the ground when it comes to ISIS police. Next, please. So Beatrice.
Yes, thank you, Ahmed.
Sure.
A few more words on our concept rebel governance and rebel rule, because we think that is quite crucial, pivotal to our understanding of ISIS, and also something that our report contributes to. In recent years, there's been a growing debate amongst scholars on governance about the role of non-state actors, criminal actors, terrorist actors in this field. A growing body of research demonstrates that oftentimes armed groups, terrorist groups, criminal groups perform all kinds of governmental practices while simultaneously engaging in destructive practices, so they can do it both. For example, the Liberation Tiger of Tamil Alam in Sri Lanka, they paired their predatory practices towards the civilian population with also serious and substantial displays of governmental rule, being described here as the implementation of governmental practices substantial displays of governmental rule vis-à-vis groups and populations in a given territory by non-state actors, leading to a de facto sovereignty and public authority. Hamas is also an example in this area, or FARC occupied areas in Colombia also display these kinds of governmental practices. So in many places, the provision of welfare, economic financial services, social services, medical care is very much in place. And here, such organizations take over from the de jure state that does not or has neglected its duties in the territory. In this body of literature, hardly many scholars have paid attention to the setup of police organizations. And Ahmed already explained so that we know a lot about the Amni, the Hizbah, the very performative and dramatic displays of terror that IS carried out. But behind the screens, on the ground, were many more mundane practices of upholding law and order, setting up a strong information system, monitoring information, intelligence gathering that helped IS take off. In fact, IS already had these kinds of police stations, structures in place before the caliphate was even announced. Next, please. Ahmed, over to you.
Thank you, Beatrice. So on the left, what we see is the Islamic State police seal, where the ISIS police officially used for its official papers to seal them. When we talk about the administrative bodies of the Islamic State associated with security and law enforcement activities on the ground, and supporting the ISIS's model rule of rebel, there are 4 important bodies that we need to understand so that there are no confusions as we go. So the Department of Judiciary and Grievances is the top body, like a secretariat under the caliphate, under the shura of the caliphate, that handled all these types of activities as the controlling body, like a ministrate. So this was on the top, and I'm going to share a hierarchy so that we can better understand as we go. The second is the Department of Public Security, the infamous Amni. So this was a high-profile, internationally infamous intelligence organization. They were both active within the caliphate and overseas. They are known there with their brutal practices, their killings, torture, and being a very secretive intelligence agent that were operating within the caliphate. A few important aspects that ISIS did not why ISIS did not use the Amni for day-to-day law enforcement practices. The Amni was scared of, so people really did not want to interact with them. They were scared of the Amni personnel, members, and their activities. They were not oftentimes known by the people on the ground. They were civilians, and they were not officially marked as ISIS officials. The Department of Religious Compliance, as we know, Hizbah, they were very active on the ground. They controlled and enforced the rules of the caliphate, but these were like mostly from the perspective of religious compliance approach. And there was somewhat an unofficial anonymity between the people and Hizbah, because Hizbah was the enforcement force of the ISIS on the ground, and they were not structured as a law enforcement agency from the perspective of a regular law enforcement agency where we can think around the world. So ISIS also from this point did not want to use Hizbah. Hizbah was because enforcing their moral ground. So they needed a police organization from this approach, and even before the caliphate was established, they started to enforce their law enforcement activities on the ground through the Islamic State police. And the main focus of this paper is going to be that police organization. Next, please. So the ISIS police was established before the caliphate was announced in June 2014. ISIS felt it was necessary to establish such an organization to emphasize its rule where they were capturing and starting to rule over. As we can remember, ISIS was growing very fast, and as soon as they would capture a town or a territory, they would establish their governmental bodies, and ISIS police was going to be one of them. They wanted to give the people under their rule a sense of security and safety through the ISIS police organization. And from the perspective of the Emni and Hizbah, they did not cover day-to-day law enforcement activities on the ground. There were three underlying rationale when we look at why and how ISIS established the Islamic State police. First of all, ISIS wanted to give the understanding and notion that it was a real state. To become a real state, you need a police organization on the ground. So ISIS police, the Islamic State police, was a reinforcement for the idea of the Islamic State. And their activities, their enforcement of the rules and law were geared towards enforcing the notion of the state. The second, the Islamic State in June 2014 released the document of the city. So basically, this was considered as a contract between the caliphate and the people living under that caliphate. ISIS asked its citizens complete loyalty and fidelity to the caliphate, and in return, they promised justice, security, accountability, protection, and other services when they were living under their control in their territories. There were 5 elements supporting the Islamic State police under this document of the city. The first was the right to justice and due process within the Islamic law. The second is the right to security of persons and property. The third is a duty to fulfill obligations required by Islam, including abstention from alcohol and drugs. The fourth is a duty of exclusive allegiance and loyalty to the Islamic State. And the fifth is entitlement to public goods and services provided by the Islamic State. So to provide these services, ISIS had to establish a body, and that body was essentially the Islamic State police. And the third was ISIS accountability and legitimacy towards the Islamic State police. Next, please. So this picture is from Raqqa Police Department Complaint Division, actually the front door of that division. And based on their publications, they had a mission statement as well. And they described themselves as the men who have taken upon themselves the safety and security of the people, swallowed and endured hardships, and used to stay up too late to establish security and safety throughout the state. So this was the mission statement we were able to find. And they also emphasized that the people are as equal as the teeth of a comb, which comes from the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad. They are using the hadith to reinforce their existence and their rule. There is no difference between the rich and the poor, and the strong and the weak, according to their statements. Next, please. So this is the structure of ISIS police organization under the Islamic State rule. What we see here is the broad ISIS police organization underneath the caliphate. So of course we have the caliph on the top, we have the Shura Council, and then we have the delegated committee, which oversaw the activities, government activities of the Islamic State. Under the delegated committee, we have the Dawawin, the ministries, Vilayat, the provinces or the cities, as we can understand. And the third is offices and the committees. Now, ISIS worked with the Dawawin and the Vilayat directly. Underneath the Dawawin, we have the Amni, D1 of the public security. We have the Hizbah as the D1 of Hizbah, but we do not have the ISIS police as a direct member of the Dawawin. Instead, we have the D1 of judgment and grievances, and ISIS was structured under this D1. In addition to being under this D1, ISIS police also directly worked with the Vilayat, because the governor of the Vilayat the governors of the Vilayat have the authority to direct and organize ISIS police under their rule. So in practice, ISIS police had two bosses. The first one, the Divan of Judgment and Grievances, and the second one was the governor of the city they were operating. So underneath the ISIS police at a given wilaya, we had the Amir of the general police in that wilaya, and then underneath we have specialized offices or bureaus like special police, where the police officers would be used as jailers, implementers or patrols on the streets, intelligence, police stations, road security, checkpoints. Checkpoints were an essential duty for the ISIS. So there was a special Amir over the checkpoints. There were two types of checkpoints, temporary and permanent checkpoints, traffic police, VIP protection, and some other duties that we are going to discuss. Next, please. So I essentially listed some of most of these duties. In addition to the duties you see here, I think they are very clear. There were some other tasks ISIS police used to carry out. On the left, what we see here is a checkpoint in Raqqa that was taken in June 2014. ISIS police was used as the long arm of the state when they were operating on the ground. So if there was a need to carry out a government associated activity, oftentimes ISIS police was sent to take care of that duty. For example, protection of tax collection, and then the money that was collected, and then the transfer of those funds. If any security detail was required, the local emirs would call the Amir of the police and send security guards wherever they were needed. Sometimes ISIS police officers acted as security personnel for the government agencies or VIPs, which were assigned by their amirs. There were repenting ceremonies in the mosques within ISIS. Oftentimes, ISIS police also oversaw the security of those ceremonies. At the early days, when the Free Syrian Army members surrendered, ISIS police would take care of their surrendering, their initial arrest and identification, and then repenting ceremonies as well. So they were used from that perspective at the very early days of ISIS. By the end of the ISIS rule, when the coalition forces were closing in, ISIS started to digging in ditches. And all of a sudden, ISIS police was again in charge of those projects. Essentially, they oversaw the digging of ditches and controlled the workers who were working on those projects before the end of the Islamic State underground. Next, please. So, Beatrice.
Yes. Well, this was the layout and the structure of the Islamic State police, the Shurta. The question is, of course, how well this organization, this structure, the police force, was accepted and supported in society. And also because one of the amirs, the amir of the police station in the village of Sahaji, said our goal was to try to win over the population. And indeed, from interviews, we heard that many people described the situation as follows. From that moment onwards, when the police stations were being manned again by IS officers, at least our lives were not under the constant threat of the regime, the Syrian regime, anymore. Its soldiers would not torture or kill us, rape our women, and loot our belongings. And there were more utterances in that respect. Previous government officials were described as the best thieves in the world. And indeed, residents living under IS rule did express comfort in the fact that IS would punish its own members, including commanders, if they abused their power or misbehaved. For example, the head of the police station in the village of Sahaji detailed how he investigated a complaint levied against an Islamic State soldier who failed to pay back $3.50 he owed to an open market chicken seller. And the amount owed would be paid back immediately. These were statements and utterances on the basis of interviews with the factors. What we also did is that we investigated and categorized the many documents that we retrieved from the police stations in Mosul and Raqqa. And the types of documents that we found were categorized by us on the basis of their document types, their function, and also the content of what was described in the documents. And interestingly enough, most of the documents pertained to complaints. And indeed, this was also a very important task of the Islamic State Police. Through the use of police stations, it served as a point of contact for local citizens to file complaints regarding various issues. And the database that we set up showed that the complaints contained issues on theft, agriculture and farm-related disputes. The one neighbor's goat is grazing on the other neighbor's terrain, for example. Domestic issues, family-related issues, quarrels, things to do with children, other kinds of interpersonal disputes, assault claims, business-related matters, debt claims, collection and settlement of money claims. And on the basis of these claims, we can assess what kind of complaints, what type of issues people brought under the rule of IS police, and also how they tried to make use of the fact that the IS police was there. So it was not just the point that the Islamic State rule came with benefits, that streets were relatively clean. It's a cliche, but something that we heard back. But also that the authority, public authority accrued by IS really had some effect. So the dynamics between the Islamic State police, the Islamic State rule and the residents showed that they did engage with each other and that these engagements were quite intense and also amounted to the settlement of law and order disputes. Next slide, please. And what we found, and this is also quite remarkable, is that the system of complaints is similar to a phenomenon that's been described in literature as the phenomenon of denunciation. The literature of denunciation derives from research into the Third Reich, Nazi rule, other investigations into dictatorships, communist dictatorships as well. And denunciation pertains to the fact that there were spontaneous communications from individual citizens to the state or to other authorities, such as the church or local police services, containing accusations of wrongdoing by other citizens or officials and implicitly or explicitly calling for punishment. It was not just reporting, it was also calling for punishment. So denunciation can be done by citizens who disclaim any personal interest, who invoke specific state, ideological or religious values instead, and we saw that happening as well. Some complaints pertain to personal interests, the goats, the agriculture, the family disputes. Other complaints also pertained to moral, to normative issues. My husband's son is smoking cigarettes. My nephew's beard is growing. He has trimmed his beard too short, for example. Denouncing and informing are closely related in this instance. And a comparison between these type of complaints also shows what happened with the complaints. Next slide, please. This is, for example, a complaint. It's being translated by the ISIS Files project and being censored for personal details. And this shows how the complaints were being described in the protocols. Claimant stated that he was trying to act as mediator to help resolve a conflict. So the claimant states that there's no personal interest, that the other person, the defendant, is speaking ill of his wife. This is sometimes a complaint that was submitted. Another complaint is about young men smoking cigarettes. This is purely denouncing on the basis of normative ideological trespasses. The third complaint is about money, about cursing, about assaulting. Next, please. So financial disputes, theft, trespassing, denunciation were very much taking place. And the question is, what happened with these disputes? And the interesting thing is that these claims were most of the times settled by the police itself. And how were they settled? Next slide, please. They were settled without a direct referral to the prosecutor, mostly. So 100 out of the 374 cases investigated were referred to a prosecutor. 88 were settled by means of financial payments. 49 were officially submitted to mediation, and a couple of others unknown. A couple of others were penalized. Direct arrest was very seldomly reported, and for the rest, we could not establish what happened to the complaints. But the interesting part here is that denunciation seemed to be not so much an issue of handing people over to the jailhouse or letting them be executed or even chopping off of hands. Denunciation seemed to be a resort for parents as well with pedagogical problems. It seems to be an instrument of social control. And it also seemed to be that they did not often result in immediate arrest or flogging or other types of penalization, but they were settled in a quite traditional, non-violent way. Of course, point is that always the threat of being referred to the prosecutor, of going to the jailhouse, was very present. And my colleague Ahmed Jayla wrote extensively about the torture in the prison system. So people knew what was going on and were very much afraid probably. And we cannot assess from the documents how afraid they were. So to what extent this type of mediation was always embedded within this larger theater of fear and of terror that of course was always there. But important fact is that the local police worked via local, quite non-violent mediative means. Next slide, please. It was resolved by reconciliation, for example. This claimant stated that he was passing by the market, he saw a quarrel, and then the claimant is asked to come to the station. The defendant is as well. And the defendant is present, the claimant is present, and reconciliation was done regarding the quarrel. People have to shake hands, they're being held accountable, sometimes also subject to penalties, and it is being signed off. And people swear, they pledge an oath that it won't happen again. And this is the way many of these disputes and quarrels were settled, not to curse ever again. Of course, it was being listed, it was being registered. And this is also how the system of denunciation worked. For example, it's a stretch to compare it, but it helps us to make sense of what we see here with the Third Reich or even with the Stasi. It was listed in files and would be reproduced if this person would do it again. Next slide, please. So the findings from this are, if you take an overview of how the Shurta worked, the variegated tasks that it executed, that Ahmed described, the way it was structured. If you also take into account how the Shurta interacted with the population, and that there was interaction, and that people did file manifold complaints to the police, we can conclude that it was rebel governance, and that the Shurta was of vital importance, perhaps even more so than the Emni or the Hisba, because it created this basis of legitimacy. It fulfilled this part of the social contract. And the number of spontaneous complaints, again, what is spontaneous in the context of a terror regime, but the number of complaints people made out of their own behalf showed that these interactions, that they worked, and that the population, at least in actions and practice, showed some kind of support for the regime. It also showed that the complaints were not just about personal interest, financial interest, also about ideological, moral, normative ideas of justice, commanding right and forbidding wrong, and it was upheld again by the population in the area. Although the Shurta carried out these conflict resolutions rather by settlement and mediation than by open oppression, I still have to compound and reiterate that the latent presence of terror always hung over the market. What Ahmed and I also discussed is that this system of mediation social settlement was partly a finding product of IS itself, partly perhaps also a finding or a way of doing business, managing a state from former Ba'ath officials, but it was also very much aligned with existing older traditions of Ottoman and Arabic settling of conflicts and justice, administering justice. The question remains whether this system of local conflict resolution would have been able to solve more complex conflicts in the future. And we also have to reckon with the fact that the Shurta's success, if we can consider it a success, was always the product of public trauma caused by the previous government, the thieves, as many people described them. So it was for them perhaps the way to survive in the area around Mosul and Raqqa. I hand over to Ahmed. Next, please.
Thank you, Beatrice, for these excellent remarks. So you'd like to conclude our presentation with our concluding remarks to take the questions. Our final question is, can we consider the Islamic State Police to be an instrument of operable, efficient rebel governance? So based on our findings, what we see is the Islamic State police was crucial for creating, consolidating, and enforcing a system of rebel rule within the ISIS territory. What we also need to understand is during the older times before the ISIS, there was an ongoing conflict within the state of Syria between the people living under Bashar Assad's minority rule. Oftentimes, among Sunni populations, there was this distrust to the government officials. There was extreme corruption. Because of those, people would not go to see the police. They would avoid at all costs going to police stations. So, in a sense, the Islamic State police filled that vacuum in those areas. And all of a sudden, people were able to go to the police stations to deal with their problems, be a family issue, be a crime, or whatever complaints they had. And the more people started to see the police and saw it was working, people started to increase showing up at different police stations. From the perspective of structure, the Islamic State Police was a modern, complex, administratively extended, and even an efficient police force based on our findings. They had their structures, they had their fundings. In fact, ISIS police was among the best paid officials within the Islamic State. So they were living the life better than the others while they were working for the Islamic State police. In the end, we found that based on this research, the Islamic State police was an instrument of the Islamic State as a brutal, extremist, and repressive system of rebel rule. Yes, they were semi-nice face of the Islamic State on the ground, but they were also at the same time the enforcing force of the state within the Islamic State territory. So with that, the next slide, please. We would like to take your questions.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation and very in-depth, covering a lot. So we have some questions coming in, but I'd like to remind our audience to please use the Q&A function at the bottom, and we'll try to get to as many questions as we can. I'd actually like to use my prerogative as moderator to kind of begin. I've had the chance, obviously, to look at these files and to get to read this report. And I think you both did such an excellent job of covering such a wide breadth of a subject that really hasn't been studied before. So congratulations on that. I'd like you to kind of tell the audience a little bit more, if that's okay, about the files that you used. You kind of had that chart with the breakdown, but I guess my question to you is, what was most interesting that you found in the files? Was there anything that was kind of contradictory to any previous knowledge that you had?
Do you want me to go first, Beatrice? So actually, like, I'm coming from the region. I was the chief of counterterrorism and operations in Şanlıurfa, bordering Syria. So like the population wise, my city of 2.5 million in Şanlıurfa was very much like with the people who were living in Syria. In fact, there were several same tribe members and relatives on the other or each part of the border. So what I see is like the complaints when they went to file those complaints to the police stations were very similar to what I was experiencing in Şanlıurfa in terms of taking the matters to the police. What I also see is an established trust between the population and the Islamic State police, because the issues, like very mundane issues, like small issues about like a beard being too short, not being able to get like a small amount of money, under normal circumstances, like modern police organizations would ignore those complaints. Like you would not go to the police in the United States for $10. But what we saw, people were very open to go to the police and file complaints or try to solve their issues. I partly find this reasoning because in the past they were not able to do so with Bashar Assad's Syrian police forces, because there was this trust issue in between and a deep corruption within the police, and also the sectarian division between the populations and the government agencies. Beatrice?
Yes, thank you, Ahmed. Yes, my background is obviously completely different from Ahmed. that makes it such a joy to have been working together on this. I'm an historian, and I worked with the archives and the records and the files from the Third Reich, Gestapo records. I also worked with Stasi records. I worked with other types of governmental police files and records. That's very much my job. And for me, it was a thrill to look into this kind of a terror regime, a small-scale dictatorship, something that it sort of was, and that needs to be conceptualized further, in fact. But to have all these complaints and these files laying on your desk, it was Timothy Garton Ash, the famous historian and publicist, once wrote that those files can be a kind of cardboard time machine, and they bring you back into the heart of how a regime worked. And these claims are very much in the heart of the regime, because this is really unique material, because it showcases the interaction between the system and the population. Of course, always within the context of terror and fear and horror. That's very much there. We should not take that aside, but it's there. And what you see in these complaint forms, and we try to describe it, it's not just about small-scale personal interest. It is, and it's interesting in itself, as Ahmed says, but it's also about small-scale ideological, religious conflicts, disputes. It's about social control. It's even parents trying to educate their children via the police, and they would never have done so in Assad's days, because the mothers were afraid that their daughters would be raped. So they very much pulled the IS police into their lives and helped them settle issues as they saw fit according to their religion. That makes it very much also an ideological, religious regime. So I found that the most interesting part of this. And for me, I think it's also important to try to conceptualize and analyze IS as a dictatorship alongside other types of historical dictatorships. So how did it work? It was not just a terrorist organization, it was a regime. It was a terror regime. But how did it work? And would it have persisted over a longer period? So these are questions that should be settled in the future, I think, regarding IS, also to prevent it from happening again.
Thank you both. We have several questions that very much overlap, and you guys have touched on this a bit, which is the actions of the Islamic State police compared to the Assad regime and the evolution. And I think you both touched on that a fair amount, but I think an interesting follow-up question is, do you think the police tried to replace tribal authorities in dispute resolution? So we talked about, Ahmed, you said that the people wouldn't go to the police for $10, but there was other sort of tribal reconciliation that was happening. And so do you think that the Islamic police tried to not only take over the official structures, but also perhaps more tribal structures?
So I think there are a few issues associated with this question. The first is those tribal structures continued. The tribes coexisted within the ISIS. But what ISIS did was to interact with them extensively. In fact, they were trying to marry tribes' daughters and women with their leadership, so that there was this trust and establishing a bond with those tribes, with the ISIS organization ruling over the tribes. So this was first approach. Several ISIS leaders married the daughters of tribe leaders, and they constantly had meetings with the tribe leaders. There were ceremonies, there were meals. So there was this ongoing interaction between the tribes and the ISIS leadership. This is, I think, the first important notion that we need to understand. The second is, as the relationship went further, people realized that instead of going to the tribe unofficially, try to fix their problems, now there was this police body, they could do it officially. And I think they also thought that ISIS police enforcement was higher than regular tribe enforcement, like regular social norms. They would be enforcing through the tribe's leaderships. The leadership of the tribe and reconciliation always existed, but I think there was a trust shift, or like comparing the authorities, police might have become a better alternative. But we should not forget the fact that there were other people living within the ISIS territories. So they weren't always local. Like the most of the ISIS police members were from other countries. Like the Tunisians were mostly the emirs, for example. So the foreign fighters also lived in those settings, and they could not go to the tribe leader. Instead, they would opt for the police.
Yes, one note in addition to that, we sort of brought up in the rear of a report that you could argue that in the way the Islamic State police operated with settling conflicts in a non-violent manner, that they sort of tuned in to local traditions in the Islamic judicial system. For example, in the old Ottoman lands in the Middle East, where different legal codes, customary laws, court systems coexist and overlap. It was often these local qadis who settled disputes in this manner. And it seemed that the shurta was also appropriated by the population to do so. This also explains why we have so many small-scale complaints, not just about finances, but also about these religious issues, but also about deeds, about loans, about rents. They also sort of use the shurta police to settle arrear debts, for example.
Even domestic violence, like we saw women complaining about their husbands, which is like very rare under those circumstances. So that also shows the trust that was established between them.
Yeah, I think you bring up a good point, is that there's several complaints that emerge that are women bringing complaints as well, which actually feeds into one of our other questions about women's roles within the police. They talk about, the question addresses that there was women, of course, in the Hizbah, the Al-Qansah Brigade, but was there any evidence, this attendee asks, about women's roles within the Islamic police?
Sorry, perhaps Ahmed can address the question about women as officers, but what I found very striking was that on the basis of the complaints, on paper at least, there was no difference made between a complaint filed by a woman or a complaint filed by a man. So it was listed, this is a woman, this is a girl, but they were invited equally with the defendant, and they had an equal say with the defendant in settling the matter. So they were treated so as it seems, and we should do more investigation into this, but it struck me as highly remarkable that it was the case, because we hear, at least I heard these stories, that women were not able to speak out and tread out and go to the authorities, but they did, and their complaints were handled in an equal fashion as they did with the male claimants or defendants. So that's, I think, very remarkable and interesting. Also shows why women did support the IS regime. About the offices, we did not find anything about it in the files, but Ahmed may know from his own work.
So we are not aware of any female officers, but what I can tell you from the stories of the defectors and our interactions with them, they would use Hizbah female members if they needed to carry out a task that required the presence of a female officer. So we have no record of a female police officer, but they would get help from the Hizbah and their female officers. Let's say for a criminal investigation, they have to body search a female. They would ask a female Hizbah to do that.
Excellent, thank you. And that actually feeds into the next question, which asks if you could delve a little bit more into the 4 policing bodies that we talked about, including the Imani, the Hizbah, the police, and the judiciary, and how that kind of emerged in the files.
Yes, very brief remark in advance. What I found again interesting is if you compare the structure and the anatomy of the caliphate with that of other dictatorships, that it was very much pillarized. So the structures were very much aligned and very much separated also from each other. So it was not just a chaos, everyone doing overlapping things. It was very well aligned. And the shurta police did things that Ahmed described, very much directed to the local population. But for example, there was no reference to foreign fighters, no reference to the Emni. So it was very much in this silo that they worked and operated. And that ties into what we know from other dictatorships, that you had, for example, the domestic police service, the domestic security service by the Stasi, for example, or the Third Reich, and they would not overlap with what the foreign service was doing. And I think the organogram, the anatomy of the caliphate will show similar issues of siloization or pillarization.
So I would like to make some comparisons so that we can better understand. The Department of Judiciary and Grievances here in the United States would be the Attorney General's ministry, like the Justice Department. So essentially where the judges, or from the perspective of ISIS, the Qadis were tied directly to the Department of Justice. And underneath that department, Shurta was operating as a local law enforcement agency. So for the United States, that would be local police department. And because they were acting as a local police department, a judge, a prosecutor, but at the same time, the governor of that local location, that local province or city, would be over Shurta structurally and hierarchically. So a judge would be able to order the Shurta, but at the same time, the governor would be able to order the Shurta. But the Shurta was essentially a local police agency, and they would oversee local policing. When we look at the EMNI, it is like the FBI in the United States, but only carrying out maybe intelligence activities. The EMNI was scared. People were afraid of the EMNI. They did not want to interact with them, and they were not operating openly. And people knew their activities and what they were doing, so they were also this fear. There was also this fear factor within the public. So they did not interact with them. They did not want to see them. EMNI had the higher authority. If they were taking over, for example, an investigation from the hands of the Shurta had no authority to say no. And based on the narratives, there were a few cases where EMNI went into the Shurta jail and grabbed people and left. And there were no stopping of those actions. So EMNI had a clear higher authority over other government bodies within the Islamic State. Hizba is morality police, the face of religious enforcement within the public.
Excellent, thank you. I think that was a very clear division. I also thought something that was interesting was often things would start at the Islamic police and then be handed over to the judiciary, and sometimes then handed back to the Islamic police to once a decision was made to make sure that reconciliation or other decision was carried out. So I think that's a very interesting interconnectivity. We were asked, is there any evidence that the ISIS police became more corrupt as time went on? We talked about in the earlier documents that sometimes we saw the Islamic police addressing kind of what would almost be a trivial issue, $3. But over time, did we see any sort of compromise, corruption start to evolve in the files?
That's a very good question, and it's a very difficult one to answer. The short answer is, well, we only have files that last for 3 years. So that's really a very short time frame, and it's very hard to assess whether there's a changement of management of dealing with complaints over that short time frame. The longer answer would be that, well, we don't know if it was going to settle, if it was going to consolidate this type of rule. Would it be able to settle complex issues? Would it be able to deal with more sectarian risks in society? So how would they deal with the lack of money that was pouring in? Because that's something that we didn't touch upon so strongly because we did not investigate it ourselves. But what was visible is that much of the money of the funding that IS stole and captivated from the population went into things as the police. So instead of putting it in their own coffers or keeping it for themselves, there were no robber barons. They put it in those services and in police services. And this was very much part and parcel of this social contract, which I think is a brilliant find, that there was really a document, almost Rousseauian-like in the French Revolution, putting out on the market spaces, this is the document for the city, this is the social contract, we will be accountable if you obey. And well, over these 3 years, they sort of lived up to that.
So I also have a few things to say about this. I think what we need to understand, and I specifically asked this question to the defectors I was talking during this project. The first is the ISIS police was paid very well compared to the rest of the ISIS structures. So they were getting good salaries. That's number one. Number two, beyond the salaries, excuse me, they were given housing and food for free. So on top of their salaries, they were also getting those perks as well. Number three, the first answer, one of the defectors told me, Are you crazy? Emni is looking for corruption all the time. Would you consider what would happen? Do you consider what would happen if a police officer seen taking a bribe or investigated for a bribe by the Emni? So there was this notion of being under control by the Emni among the police officers. Number four, many of them were from other countries like Tunisia. So they were not like very close bodies within the patrols. When they are operating out on the streets, they could not trust each other for such a crime. So let's say somebody is taking bribes, the other officer who saw that could easily turn that officer in. So there wasn't this established bond between the officers because they were from different countries or from different localizations. There was one case, one of the defectors told us that one of the police chiefs were caught with a woman with whom he was unrelated. And of course, this is a huge issue. Immediately after that chief was seen with that woman, he was arrested. Everybody thought that he was going to be killed, but the issue was covered up. And eventually that chief was transferred to another city. And one of the defectors saw that chief working as a traffic police officer in that city. So yes, there were some problems and maybe some corruption from the perspective of religion. But in this case, the person was not appropriately punished from the perspective of the Islamic State's law.
Yeah. Another question we got was, how pervasive were the police in Islamic State controlled territory? Were their presence dependent on the particular locale or any other factor?
This is, again, I think it is difficult to assess. We had files from Mosul and Raqqa, and there were about 3,000 police agents active, and that's quite a lot. And if you discuss that, and Ahmed talked to the defectors, there's far more police agents on the ground, as for example under Assad. At the same time, that doesn't say that much. The pervasiveness also depends on how well the population cooperates. Again, sorry for this bringing up this comparison all the time, but it's important. It makes things clear. The Gestapo was a force of 20,000 officers in a country of 60 million Germans. So you could say the Gestapo was not that pervasive, but it was, because it could rely on this ideological control, the ideological support in society. And the complaints sort of make the case that this support was there in society in Mosul and Raqqa, that people did report each other and they had to be afraid of each other. And just yesterday, a journalist in the Netherlands made a small reportage on our report that also discussed this with people in Raqqa, who also confirmed this point, that they were being betrayed by their uncles, by their aunts, by their neighbors. So they knew that everyone was kind of controlling each other and was helping out with the regime. So the regime was in this respect pervasive. It was there. People complied.
The fear factor always existed. They knew ISIS was a terrorist organization, but with their own words, they told us as long as they stuck to those rules, they complied with those rules, they were fine. At least, like, they were very open about it. They were not being raped, they were not being tortured, and they knew they would not be killed if they applied the rules of the Islamic State. So that fear factor, I guess, contributed to the utilization of the Islamic State police.
Excellent. And I think it's really interesting, you talked about corruption, but another question asked about, were there any indication in the documents of what would happen if a member of the police objected to imposing a particular punishment or objected to any other police action? Was there any internal dissent tolerated within the police? And if not, what happened to dissenters?
I have not seen any dissenting within those documents.
Yeah, I agree. I hadn't seen anything that talked on this as well. And I should clarify, these are a collection of documents collected at a specific time and place. They are not the end all be all. They are providing a really interesting glimpse into one aspect of what we are able to kind of know, but are not the complete knowledge. Thank you. Another question that came up is, to what extent do the pillars of the police units, we spoke about those a bit earlier, harken back to the Iraqi or Syrian intelligence structures and their corresponding silos?
I think the most important aspect what we need to understand here is the Ba'athist influence over the Islamic State agencies or structures. Like, this influence started from the Abu Ghraib prison. In fact, when they were structuring the EMNI, it was almost solely based on the Ba'athist intelligence agencies and the understanding of Iraqi intelligence, how it was running. So from that perspective, I can easily say that the Ba'athist influence was over there. I think there is like an animosity and hatred towards the Syrian regime. So apart from local social norms, I could easily see that they really did not want to go with the things as the Syrians or Bashar Assad regime was doing in the past. So there is like a pushback against the practices of the Syrian regime. But as Beatrice mentioned, there is this continuing understanding coming from the Ottoman times and tribal traditions, and we see those traditions and rules were embedded into the structures and agencies and their day-to-day practices.
Yes. Yes, I would also like to contribute with a kind of more an essayistic thought, if I may. On top of what we found these Ottoman traditions, these local traditions of conflict settlement. We also found this very strong presence of Ba'athist governance rule, which makes IS completely different from Al Qaeda, for example. The whole fact that they had this anatomy, that they had this chart with the various institutions, and it was very well thought through. It's far more like a blueprint for a state than for any other terrorist organization. And this is my essayistic thought. And I wrote about this in a Dutch article. As I said, I've been doing research into the Stasi archives for a long time now. And recently I published an article on the question whether some of the influence of the way the Stasi set up a security state was translated into the Ba'athist parties in a quite direct way, because up until 1990, so the last months of the GDR, the German Democratic Republic, Ba'athist officials from Iraq, but also Syria and Yemen, they were invited to East Berlin for 3 months a year to take a higher training. So it was for the higher cadre, for the officials who did their training there. And many of them did, thousands of them did, in fact. So people that were 30, 40 years of age, or perhaps 20 in 1980s, they would bring that knowledge back into Iraq. And the way the Ba'ath party was structured itself very much mirrors, is an echo of how a communist party set up both ideological rule, ideological police, and then also state rule. It's a very complex system of controlling and reciprocal controlling agencies. And this is something that we also see back a little bit in the structure of the caliphate. Of course, we should not stretch these things. That's why I said it's essayistic, but it's very strange to find this within a terrorist organization. It's not something that you encounter a lot.
Thank you. I have one more question, and then I would like to offer us a moment to wrap up with final thoughts. But looking at the list of crimes listed in these police reports, looking at the police reports, the reconciliation, can you both touch on how you think the Islamic State used its police forces to further its both governance strategy and its ideology?
So the ideology was always there. We should always understand that they were operating under the rules and orders of the judges, the qadis, and the prosecutors. And that body represented the Islamic State's perception of the Sharia law. So the ideology existed as a rule and as a practice all the time. We cannot separate ISIS police from the ISIS ideology, because the whole policing is based on that ideology. The enforcement is for enforcing the Sharia law, essentially, from their perspective. the ideology always existed, and everybody within the force and within the ISIS structure kind of controlled each other if that ideology was being enforced in people's daily lives. So as a police officer, are you praying? Are you smoking? Are you using drugs? Are you cursing? Like all those were questioned by their peers. So there was this overall reinforcement of that ideology within the ISIS structure everywhere. And that existed with the police too.
If I may give a very concrete example, I told before, if you look into communist files or Nazi files, you see the eagle of the Nazis, the communist seal of the party, in the name of the party, in the name of the people, and similar signs are present in the files of IS. Here's, for example, a file that indicates a request for reconciliation, drafted by the police station, and it starts with, in the name of God, the compassionate and merciful, request for reconciliation, praise to be God, the Almighty said. So texts and verses are being quoted, and then it continues with quite more mundane, business-like protocol. The claimant was present, the defendant was present, reconciliation was done, and then if they fail to reconcile, both parties shall be subject to penalties in accordance with Sharia law, and then the seal of the caliphate again. So it's a very strange and fascinating mixture of religion, ideology, seals, rituals, verses, and then also ordinary protocols, as any other police force would do. So the complaints in themselves are very fascinating documents to study.
Thank you. And we look forward to being able to share these with everyone else so that they can understand a bit about the documents, the files, how they evolved over time. Some of them handwritten, some of them typed. And it's very interesting to kind of see this process. I'd like to end with opening the floor to our esteemed speakers, if they had any final thoughts that they wanted to kind of present, or any major takeaways that they really want to convey to our audience about this report. Ahmed, we'll start with you.
Okay, thank you. So I think in the end, what I can say, ISIS police was a successful practice on the ground. They gained the trust of the populations within the Islamic State. We do not see a lot of issues that are associated with the Emni and Hizbah in terms of people's complaints about them, their brutality. So ISIS police was seen kind of like regular police officers carrying out community policing within the societies in the West. So there was this notion of interaction and trust between the agency, the agents, and the people. I think partly because ISIS was very upfront about it. They really wanted to gain the trust of their subjects, as they say. And also there were a lot of different nationalities that were represented within the structures of the Islamic State police. So they had to apply the rules that they were imposed. There were no room for corruption or making mistakes within the police because there was this self-control constantly ongoing through that mixture. Beatrice?
Yes, thank you, Ahmed. Yes, well, I think one of the most striking findings for me was the fact that IS rolled out this police force so swiftly, with so much money involved, so effectively. It did so even before it pronounced the caliphate, and it also upheld this rule until the end, as far as we can see. And the success of the Shurta, in the way we gauged it, very much was the product of the public trauma amongst the people in place, their grievances, their way they had been treated by previous governments. And I think this sort of spells out the threat that emanates from IS still. If you look at what's going on in Africa right now, or could be going on again in the Middle East, is that if there is a territory with a population that is severely repressed, that feels grievances, and an organization enters with monies and fundings and that promises and even gives an amount of order and control and even prosperity, then it will be sweep up the population in that area. And that is something that I think we can learn from these documents. And it's also something that has remained hidden from our public face. We've studied the drama, the beheadings, all the horrible things, but this is what really was going on the ground.
So, like for example, when we were talking to the defectors, one example was very striking for me. They said in the past, yes, there were, for example, waste management services within a municipality, but you could never see a worker really working on the ground and collecting the trash, though they were going to get paid because they were the loyals for the Bashar Assad's minority state. But under ISIS, all the trash were collected on time. The workers were working very harshly. They were always there. The streets were clean. So this was the perception the people were reflecting on the ground. When they were living under the ISIS rule, the police was also enforcing it, and the workers were there helping people. This was perceived as a positive development by the public.
Excellent, thank you. And I think you touch on some really interesting points. Often when we talk about the Islamic State, we do talk about its immense brutality, which should definitely be emphasized. But understudied is the understanding of the bureaucratic aspects and the administration of the organization. And I think this paper really helps to shed some light on that. And we have several forthcoming papers and files that will also help to expand on that. I'd very much like to thank our speakers, Dr. Beatrice de Goff and Dr. Ahmed Yela, for joining us today. Please check out isisfiles.gwu.edu to read this report, as well as look at several other files. Keep checking it out. We'll be updating with more reports, more files as time comes. Again, I'd like to thank the GW Libraries and Academic Innovation for their continued cooperation. And thank you all for joining us today. Have a good one.
Thank you. Have a great day.